Tonight on Nation to Nation, the co-founder of Idle No More says substandard housing has caused untold sadness.
And that's what dehumanization and domination does to oppressed people. We begin to believe that we are not worthy.
Donald Trump approved the Keystone pipeline. The state of Nebraska may be the only thing that stands in its way.
Which is built by a foreign company using foreign oil made with foreign steel for the foreign export market. So that's really all risk and no reward for Nebraskans.
And last night, controversial Senator Lynn Beyak heard from a residential school survivor.
It's just an awful, lifelong struggle.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Todd Lamarand. You may know Sylvia McAdam as one of the co-founders of Idle No More, but providing on-reserve housing has become increasingly important. She has organized a campaign called One House, Many Nations over a year ago. It built a house and delivered it to the Big River First Nation in Saskatchewan. It's just a drop in the bucket, however. Sylvia McAdam now joins me by Skype to talk about housing. And it started when she ran for chief of her reserve. Welcome, Ms. McAdam.
Thanks, sir.
What was it about running for chief that led to One House, Many Nations?
Well, I'm not a politician by any stretch of the imagination, but I knew that perhaps going door to door would be helpful. So that's what I did. And to make a long story short, I ended up at the door of a gentleman that was basically living in a shanty. It's like he dug a hole in the ground and, put some boards together and was living there. And, that kind of living conditions impacts a human being. Like, that's the dehumanization and domination of Indigenous people, because shelter is a human right, and it's also a treaty term and promise. So I told him even if I didn't get in for chief, I would do something about his situation.
My understanding his situation had been a long one. He'd been living in the shanty for 16 years?
He had been, yeah. He was going on his 16 years that fall when I met him.
Do you know why he had to live in this condition?
Well, he was a single man. He had finished raising all of his children. He had been struggling previously with addictions. So we're not only looking at him as a single person, but a person struggling with addictions that made him perceived as unworthy of a shelter. So I think that's one of the issues with when we look at shelter on reserve. We tend to prioritize families, and we should. But then we have people that fall through the cracks like he did,
How did you come to the point where you built a little mini house for him?
Well, I didn't get in for chief. And so we immediately began a fundraiser for him. And I work with an amazing group of people like Alex Wilson, Sheila McLean, the Idle No More comms team. It's just this immense amount of support that came through when we started the fundraiser. And we fundraised approximately $35,000. And many homes in Manitoba came forward to volunteer their time to build him a home. And this gentleman is the face of hundreds, if not thousands of people all across these lands. And I think when we look at Canada celebrating 150 years of colonization, we need to push that back and let Canada know they need to address the issues of not only shelter, but of land. We only have less than 0.2% of our land. The rest of the land has been taken over by colonization, dispossession, and I think that should be a very big issue, not only about shelter, but also about land.
Of course, thousands of houses across Canada need to be built or renovated. How can building this one house off the grid help in that?
I think our primary goal is to demonstrate to the public that this is absolutely possible. That is absolutely possible to have wood stoves that can generate electricity, shelter that can live off the grid, that we need to start moving away from fossil fuels, our dependence on it, and also demonstrating to the public that human beings, such as every one of us, everyday people, can do these similar actions in their own community. We're also doing another build, and that's coming up very quickly here, and we're doing another fundraiser. And we've been invited to Toronto September 28th to October 8th, and it's an expo for design, innovation, and technology. And we're going to build a shelter that utilizes alternative energy, other alternative sources of builds. So our fundraiser is called One House, Many Nations Sustainable Homes Design Project by Kickstarter. And so in order to begin envisioning alternative shelters, what One House, Many Nations does is we investigate these other sources, and we put to the public that, look, this is absolutely possible, that shelters that have the worldview of Indigenous people, the build from Indigenous laws that mitigate the footprint out on the land and utilizes our systems of way of being and doing. So that's our idea that we're putting to the expo in the fall.
The federal government just recently, of course, in its past budget, promised over $1 billion to on-reserve infrastructure, water, schools, and housing. How did you feel about that announcement?
Well, it's a good start. It's a good start, but like any other fiscal funding, it always falls short. And that's always the story when it comes to the funding of anything that has to do with Indigenous people. And we see that with Cindy Blackstock and the issues coming out of that. And I think as Indigenous people and all people in general, we need to be outraged about the racism attached to not funding Indigenous people on par with all other peoples. And that's the process of dehumanization on domination of Indigenous people, and we need to quit accepting that.
Very quickly, we're almost out of time, Ms. McAdam, but what happened when you finally delivered that house to that gentleman?
It was heartbreaking, because he became emotional, so did his children. And for a while there, I think he struggled with feeling worthy of this beautiful shelter. And that's what dehumanization and domination does to oppressed people. We begin to believe that we are not worthy. And now he's moved in there, he's living in there, but like I said, he's easily the face of hundreds and thousands of Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, which is why we called it One House, Many Nations. It's not to target Indigenous people. This is the voices of all homeless people.
On that note, I want to thank you, Ms. McAdam, for speaking to me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Time for a break, but when we come back, we speak to Hannah Atta, Bold, Nebraska. Her group wants to stop the Keystone pipeline dead in its tracks. Don't go away. Welcome back. Last week, U.S. President Donald Trump reversed the policy of his predecessor, Barack Obama, and approved the Keystone XL pipeline. It's welcome news to Natural Resource Minister Jim Carr, who emphasized the thousands of jobs Keystone and two other federally approved pipelines will create. Although Keystone has all its Canadian approvals, the biggest stumbling block to it getting built could be the state of Nebraska.
My first experience with TransCanada was just receiving telephone calls saying that they were considering putting a major oil pipeline through our property, and actually I thought it was a practical joke from some of our friends. I didn't believe that that was even remotely possible.
TransCanada had maps all over the table. And we started walking the table, and Mike pointed, and I went, oh my God, it is us. I'll never forget that moment. We were just devastated.
Later offered me $250,000 to come through my 240 acres. And I told him no.
I'll never forget the shock that I was in, and I remember saying no.
When the Keystone first came knocking on our door, it was Myron Stafford, who was a minister, and he was classic. He was very smooth, and said, "Oh, Nebraskans are salt of the earth," and all this other stuff.
And then we were contacted by a land agent, of course, to right away just sign, and we were very leery, knew nothing about it, so we just told him that we wanted to learn more about it.
It's gonna be wonderful, and you know, when she got done with her spiel, it was like, oh my gosh, you're un-American if you don't sign up for this thing.
That state's Public Service Commission will begin reviewing the project, a process that could take 8 to 12 months. Joining me now is Hannah Adams. She's Deputy Director of Bold Alliance, an alliance of ranchers, Native American tribes, and citizens against Keystone. Ms. Adams, thank you for joining me.
Yep, thanks for having me.
After President Obama refused to approve Keystone, did you think this was now a done deal?
Yes, we were hoping it was a done deal. Unfortunately, once President Trump was elected, we knew that this would be coming down the pike, and so we've been prepping for this decision since November of 2016.
What kind of preparations have you been doing?
Basically bringing the gang back together, so having meetings with landowners and tribes and other supporters in Nebraska to gear back up again for this fight, and with the intention of fighting and stopping this pipeline once again.
Now, Nebraska is a very red, Republican-dominated state. I mean, what chance do you think of making the case of having Keystone killed there?
Yeah, Nebraska is a predominantly Republican state, but to be honest, this issue transcends the typical partisan politics, and it really comes down to the basic American value of property rights, and standing up to private corporations and saying that you can't take Americans' land for your own private gain. So we've got supporters that are Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, because they all know that at the end of the day, TransCanada doesn't care who you vote for or what party you belong to when they're taking your land using eminent domain.
Now, so far, you've used Bold Alliance and Bold Nebraska, a number of public relations tactics and media events, which you can see on YouTube, to protest Keystone. If these fail, will you consider more direct action?
Yeah, but to be honest, that's a long way down the road. So the Public Service Commission process is at least an 8-month process. And so we're very focused on that in Nebraska right now, and showing the 5 commissioners on that commission that Nebraskans don't want this pipeline, and we have no intention of it being built.
Talking about this commission, how much influence does this Public Service Commission in Nebraska have on the outcome of whether Keystone gets built or not?
It has the ultimate decision. So they have to decide whether or not to approve the route that TransCanada has put forward. And so we're right now focused on getting calls and letters into the Public Service Commissioners to tell them that Nebraskans don't want this pipeline.
Now, a number of landowners and ranchers along that pipeline route have complained about TransCanada's tactics, threatening to use eminent domain. What is it, and how do you oppose it?
Eminent domain is basically the use by private corporations to take land from individuals for their own private gain. So we are completely against eminent domain for private gain, especially with a pipeline like this, which is built by a foreign company using foreign oil made with foreign steel for the foreign export market. So that's really all risk and no reward for Nebraskans.
Now, of course, you mentioned earlier that we're a long ways away from possibly having this being built, or the TransCanada starting to build it. But do you foresee a Standing Rock happening, but in Nebraska?
I think we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But again, we want everyone to focus on the task at hand, which is putting pressure and showing support for the land defenders and for landowners and tribes that have basically been fighting this pipeline for the last 6 years, and telling the Public Service Commission that we don't want it built in Nebraska.
It appears Big Oil has one in Standing Rock with oil now in the pipeline. I guess does that, how do you feel about that? How was your confidence as you fight against Keystone now?
We're really confident that we're able to stop this pipeline in Nebraska. It's a different process than what happened up at Standing Rock, and we got involved in it a lot earlier, and so we have the ability to actually stop this from happening before the route gets approved by the Public Service Commission.
I guess what's the biggest difference between Nebraska and Standing Rock?
The biggest difference is that the pipe, for the most part, was already in the ground for the Dakota Access Pipeline. For Keystone, the pipe hasn't been put in the ground yet because they need this route approved through Nebraska.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Adams, for coming on and talking to me about this.
Thanks.
When we come back, Senator Lynn Beyak comes face to face with 2 residential school survivors. It happened last night at the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples. Don't go away. Welcome back. Senator Lynn Beyak is well known for her controversial remarks on residential schools. She has been asked to stand down from her role on the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal People. So far, she's refused. Last night, 2 residential school survivors, John Morrisseau and Doris Young, presented there, and Beyak asked a question. First, she tried to put her previous remarks into context.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Thank you for your very moving and heart-touching testimonials, and also for your recommendations, Doris, the free, especially language. And thank you for being here again, John, and for the recommendations for education. The speech that caused so much hurt and distress was actually a speech about taxes. That's my mission here in the Senate, is the wise use of tax dollars. And I was questioning why we were renaming buildings all across Canada when a teenage Aboriginal child on a reserve in Canada has never had a glass of clean water, as you pointed out, Doris. It seemed like our priorities are skewed. So I asked for a national audit of all dollars coming in and out of every reserve, and I asked for a national referendum of every individual Métis, Inuit, and Aboriginal across Canada over the age of 12. What are your dreams and goals? Where do you want to live? And what would you tell the government to do with the tax dollars, instead of wasting the billions that we have wasted over decades, and still you have no education in Crane River, and you have no language teachers in the PA. I want to do something differently so that your shared grandchild has a better life, and the grandchildren in my riding have a better life than what we've been doing. It's not working, and I wondered if you would have some thoughts on that. Thank you.
I'm not sure how to respond when you know, a different kind of a system is being contemplated about fixing something that's, you know, that's so large right now, and to try something different, like talking about tax dollars. I don't know. We had the Premier come to our community one afternoon, and he stood there and said, this building that we're in, which is the University College of the North, was built on our tax dollars. And he looked straight at all the Aboriginal people, the First Nations people, and we just froze. You know, we thought, is he telling us that we don't pay tax, or is he punishing us because some of us don't always pay tax? So when you start talking about tax dollars, then it puts up some real walls. So there might be another avenue that could be explored, and maybe in that same way, but not talking about tax dollars. You know.
Earlier in the session, Senator Patrick Brazo asked the presenters for their thoughts on people who think residential schools were a positive experience. However, he did not name Beyak personally.
Now, unfortunately, there are still people in this country who believe that residential schools were a good thing, was positive. So I would like to know what your thoughts are and what you would recommend to those people who thought that residential schools were a good thing.
I went to residential school for 13 years, and there are times when I can talk about it and not have a tear. And like tonight, I had no idea this was going to happen. And it comes and goes, and it's like an emotion that you cannot control. Sometimes I think about the losses that I had and the fears and the experiences, the bad ones that I had at the schools will be with me forever. No one will ever be able to take them away from my body, from my mind, from my soul. I can deal with them most of the time, but there's times when it's just not possible, like it was tonight. So anybody that has been taken away from their mother and father and their community, like we were, forcibly, and punished for being who we are, for speaking a language, for having long hair, because we were Cree. Cannot imagine what it's like to be punished because you're Ukrainian in Canada, because you're another nationality. It's just an awful, lifelong struggle to deal with those emotions. When I said I was suicidal, there are many, many people that are still like that. I'm not suicidal anymore, but suicide is a very, very uninvited feeling that you don't know when it's going to happen. It happens. You look at windows, you look at fast-moving cars, and you don't know why. But deep down, it's that suicidal feeling. So to the people that don't understand what we went through, not to get an education, it was a policy that our parents had no control over. The law said we had to go. And they took us. Our mother and father didn't say, yes, go. I'd like you to. No, they didn't say that. They came and they took us. Just like what the TRC report says. They came and they took us away.
A spokesperson for interim Conservative leader Rona Ambrose says Beyak's views don't reflect the Conservative position on residential schools. And Ambrose finds Beyak's opinions unexplainable. That's our show. Next week, Jorge Barrera will be here. I'm Todd Lamarand. Have a great evening.